I'm Nima Rajan. The main federal party leaders were in central Canada today as the election campaign enters its fourth week. Liberal leader Justin Trudeau started the day in Montreal, where he talked about his housing plan. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole was at his Ottawa hotel base, where he announced a plan to lower internet and phone bills. In Toronto, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh said an NDP government would double funding for cities to electrify their public transportation. Canada's political party leaders were hard at work on Labor Day, promising better working conditions, more benefits for workers, and added supports for businesses. With less than 2 weeks to go before Election Day on September 20th, all three leaders spent the day in vote-rich Ontario. Liberal leader Justin Trudeau campaigned in southern Ontario on Labor Day. Mr. Trudeau promised that a re-elected Liberal government will expand the hiring and worker support programs that his government introduced during the COVID-19 pandemic. Also yesterday, angry protesters threw gravel at Mr. Trudeau and his supporters at a campaign stop. He said today that the RCMP will decide whether or not to press charges. Meanwhile, Conservative leader Erin O'Toole spent Labor Day trying to clear up the confusion over his party's gun policy. The Conservative Party platform promises to repeal a 2020 cabinet order banning 1,500 makes and models of firearms. On one hand, Mr. O'Toole says he hasn't changed his stance on the Liberal gun ban, but he also says he'd keep it in place if elected, but it will be reviewed. Mr. O'Toole said in Thursday's TVA debate that he would maintain a ban on assault weapons, but he remains evasive about whether he was referring to the 2020 ban or an earlier law. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh used a Labor Day campaign stop to highlight his party's commitment to universal childcare, higher minimum wages, and paid sick leave. Flanked by supporters in the traditional New Democrat stronghold of Hamilton, Mr. Singh says the Liberals didn't push through measures such as paid sick leave for federal workers when they had the chance. Mr. Singh says while many vulnerable workers fall under provincial jurisdiction, it's important for the federal government to show leadership. The head of the Canadian Labour Congress says federal parties vying for votes on September 20th need to have plans to replace lost jobs from the pandemic with better positions. B. Brusk says those with the new jobs should have decent pay, benefits, and pathways to unionization. She also says Labour groups have other issues that the parties are looking to address, including pharmacare and climate change. Sunday marked 1,000 days since Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were first detained in China. About 150 people gathered in Ottawa, led by Mr. Spavor's brother Paul, to walk an hour and a half to a park near Parliament Hill. This was to replicate the 7,000 steps Mr. Kovrig has tried to walk every day in his cramped jail cell to maintain his well-being. The two Michaels were arrested in apparent retaliation for the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. As of early this morning, fully vaccinated foreign nationals are allowed to visit Canada for non-essential reasons. Canada Border Service Agency Vice President Dennis Vinette says the pandemic-triggered restrictions were eased at midnight, but he adds just like Canadian and American citizens who were allowed back over the border a month ago, travelers need to be asymptomatic and meet specific conditions. Groups representing Canadian doctors and hospitals say healthcare workers are being harassed by anti-vaccine protesters. The Canadian Medical Association, Ontario Medical Association, and Ontario Hospital Association are trying to bring attention to the issue. The groups say protesters opposing COVID-19 vaccination rules set up outside hospitals this week and in some cases blocked access to ambulances and other medical services. A new study suggests recent cannabis use is linked with a higher risk of heart attacks in young adults. An analysis led by Toronto researchers looked at U.S. data from a survey that included 33,000 adults aged 18 to 44. 17% of them reported cannabis use in the past month. Heart attacks were reported in 1.3% of the cannabis users compared to 0.8% of non-users. The study found cannabis users were more likely to be male, smoke cigarettes, use e-cigarettes, and be heavy alcohol drinkers, which may also contribute to their risk of heart attack. The data was published today in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. A recall has been issued regarding a brand of bacon due to a possible listeria contamination. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency says test results triggered the recall of European butcher brand bacon chunks. The product was sold in Ontario in packages of approximately 200 grams, with best before dates of October 15th and 22nd of this year. All right, stay with us. After the break, we speak with UN Women, the UN's entity on gender equality and the empowerment of women, on the situation in Afghanistan and how women in particular are affected. We'll have an interview with Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, Miss Anita Bhatia, coming up next. That and, of course, more news from around the world on Forum Daily, so stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break. A group of Afghan women demanding equal rights from their country's new rulers say they were pepper sprayed and shot with stun guns by the Taliban. The women's march on Saturday, the second in as many days in Kabul, began peacefully. However, the rally was broken up after the Taliban fighters began firing their weapons in the air, scattering the group. One demonstrator says she was there to be the voice of those unable or too frightened of the Taliban to leave their homes, go to school, or live their lives. The Taliban have promised an inclusive government and a moderate form of Islamic rule. But many Afghans, especially women, fear losing the rights they gained over the last 2 decades. Well, joining us now to give us a perspective of the challenges that women in Afghanistan currently face is Miss Anita Bhatia, Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. Ma'am, welcome back to Forum Daily.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, let's start with this, ma'am. What do we know so far about the women's rights rally in Kabul and how all of that played out?
Well, what we know is that a bunch of incredibly brave women, and I do want to give a shout out to them, gathered to protest for their human rights, which are the rights to be represented, to live a life free of fear, to want to seek inclusion in the new government. And they were dispersed through acts of intimidation and violence. That's what we know. And we are very, very upset about this. And we want the Taliban to walk the talk on protecting women's rights.
And considering all the progress Afghanistan has made in the past 20 years in terms of women's rights, what kind of challenges do women in Afghanistan face now due to this Taliban takeover?
Well, very fundamental challenges. First of all, a number of women are living in fear of their lives. So we are talking about the right to live a life without fear. We're also looking at a rolling back of all of the gains of the last 2 decades, which means the right to education, to send girls to school, for women to participate fully in public life, to be in media, in parliament, in business, in education. We're facing a situation where all of these rights may be swept away.
And we know the Taliban has promised an inclusive government with more rights for women, including women in government roles. We know that the Taliban announced its cabinet today. So what is your response to this promise that they made previously?
Well, there's a very big gap between the talking and the walking. The cabinet that has just been announced does not include any women. And this is something that we are taking issue with. We will issue a public statement which lays out UN Women's position on this. And we are really dismayed and very much regret the lack of an inclusive government as it has been done so far. And we've also learned that the women's ministry, there's a ministry in Afghanistan currently which is in charge of women's affairs, that this ministry will be dismantled. We don't have full confirmation of this yet, but early reports suggest that the attention to women's rights, which the Taliban had promised, is not actually being followed through.
All right, ma'am, just about 2 minutes left here, but we know UN Women is on the ground in Afghanistan. Would you be able to speak towards how the women in the country are responding to the overall Taliban takeover?
Look, women are scared. I mean, fundamentally, this is the issue, that women are in fear of their lives and they are in fear of losing fundamental freedoms that they have gained over the last 20 years. So, we are on the ground and we committed to staying because the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, had said, we will stay and deliver for the people of Afghanistan. And we're committed to doing that. And from the women's rights groups on the ground, I can tell you that what we are hearing is that women are in fear of their lives, and also fear losing fundamental freedoms, which is why the world cannot forget about Afghanistan.
All right, ma'am, just about a minute left, but what work is UN Women currently doing on the ground in Afghanistan?
Well, we're part of the discussions with the Taliban. as part of the larger United Nations country team on the ground, because Afghanistan is also facing a humanitarian crisis. There are millions of people who may not have enough to eat, and there are millions without access to healthcare. So as part of our discussions with the Taliban to ensure that there's humanitarian access, we also are pushing for a continued focus on women's rights and women's freedoms.
All right, ma'am, just about 30 seconds left, but really quickly, how can our Canadian viewers help in this situation?
Don't forget about Afghanistan. The news cycle moves quickly. People will forget this happened. And I urge all your viewers to keep the focus on Afghanistan and Afghani women. Contribute by donating to UNHCR, to the World Food Programme, and to UN Women.
All right, Ms. Bhatia, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.
We'll be right back, everyone. The head of the BC Teachers Federation says there's no rationale for the province to no longer issue notices about exposure to COVID-19 in schools. Terry Mooring says parents are stressed and want that information, as do teachers. And she doesn't understand why Provincial Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry says the notices created anxiety for parents last year. Ms. Mooring says data on exposure to COVID-19 and case numbers in schools should be publicly available through the BC Centre for Disease Control's website. Some members of the food and beverage industry are calling for greater clarity on BC's COVID-19 vaccine card system to make the transition as smooth as possible. Jeff Gignard, the executive director at Alliance of Beverage Licensees, says restaurants and bars are working as fast as they can to get ready for the impending launch. The cards will be required as of September 13th for residents to get into clubs, restaurants, ticketed sporting events, along with some organized events like weddings. Alberta's health delivery body says it's turning to staffing agencies for nurses as a last resort. Alberta Health Services said by email that a critical staffing challenge is limiting its ability to open additional beds, which it says is straining its ability to care for patients. The news follows announcements on Friday of another round of surgery cancellations, as well as the return of a province-wide mask mandate. Alberta has seen a surge in COVID-19 cases, averaging more than 1,000 a day for the past week, which is currently the highest in Canada. Manitoba and Nova Scotia will join BC and the Northwest Territories in observing the new National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on September 30th. Other provinces and territories are encouraging employees to reflect and commemorate the day in their own ways. The day is designed to encourage contemplation of the history and harmful legacy of residential schools. The federal government passed legislation in June giving the statutory holiday to all federal employees and workers in federally regulated workplaces. Starting today in Manitoba, the maximum number of people allowed at outdoor gatherings drops from 1,500 to 500. Food courts, museums, and galleries will also require visitors to show immunization records. The measures were announced last week as the province strengthens its public health measures to fend off a fourth wave of COVID-19. Well, today was the first day of back to school across much of Ontario. Classes resumed today in many boards, including Halton, Niagara, and Blue Water. Some other school boards, including the Toronto District School Board, are waiting for Thursday before sending students back to class. This will be the third pandemic-altered academic year for the province's students. The Ministry of Education has said staff and students in grades 1 through 12 will have to wear masks, and everyone needs to be self-screened for COVID-19 symptoms daily. A 36-year-old Quebec man who was the subject of a province-wide manhunt after his 3-year-old son went missing is now facing a weapons charge. Police issued an Amber Alert that remained in effect for 4 days after the boy went missing on Tuesday, and investigators named the father as a suspect. The two were found not far from where they were last seen. The boy has been safely reunited with his mother. Quebec is introducing a mediation pilot project that the government says could lead to better child protection intervention. The province hopes to improve interventions with an independent, free, and fast mediation service. Mediation is now a possible new avenue before going to court and will be offered after a deadlock or when voluntary agreements are refused. The project comes following a 2-year investigation that was prompted by the April 2019 death of a 7-year-old girl in Granby. One of New Brunswick's health authorities is asking residents to limit their visits to an emergency department in the midst of a growing outbreak of COVID-19. Vita Light Health Network has asked residents in the Saint-Quentin area to reduce their trips to Hôtel de Saint-Joseph de Saint-Quentin. Officials say the outbreak is placing increased pressure on the healthcare workers at the facility. Nova Scotia Health's COVID-19 vaccine outreach will be offering drop-in clinics across the northern region of the province this week. The province says the clinics will be held in Kennetcook, Scottsburn, and Oxford. Officials say they'll be open for those 12 years and older to help with vaccine accessibility for community members. Residents will have access to the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine at the clinics. New research suggests climate change and warming oceans could be linked to a decrease in the North Atlantic right whale population. A peer-reviewed report found warmer water in the Gulf of Maine and the Scotian Shelf has forced crustaceans out of the area and created poor foraging conditions for the whales. All right, we take a look at what's making news around the world after the break as 2 U.S. jobless benefit programs expire. China's import and export growth accelerates in August, and the Taliban seize the last province not in their control in Afghanistan. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world coming up on Forum Daily after a short break. So stay with us, everyone. We will be right back. Two critical American jobless benefit programs have expired. One program provided jobless aid to self-employed and gig workers, and another provided benefits to those who have been unemployed more than 6 months. Americans still struggling in the pandemic will find a smaller patchwork of social support programs. China's import and export growth accelerated in August despite disruptions due to the spread of the Delta variant of COVID-19. Customs data reported Tuesday shows that exports rose 25.6% to $294 billion U.S. This while imports rose 33% to $236 billion. The main underground group coordinating resistance to Myanmar's military government has called for a nationwide uprising. The group's acting president has called for revolt in every village, town, and city in the entire country at the same time. The National Unity Government is composed of elected legislators barred from taking their seats after February's military coup. The Taliban say they have seized control of the last Afghan province not in their control. They overran forces who had opposed their takeover. According to witnesses, thousands of Taliban fighters charged into 8 districts of Panjshir province overnight. The Taliban has also announced an interim cabinet, including individuals who fought against the Afghan government and its international allies. Guinea's new military leaders are seeking to tighten their grip on power and are ordering their deposed president's soldiers to join them. Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya also barred government officials from leaving the West African nation, ordering them to hand over their passports and government vehicles. Guinea's governors have been replaced by regional military commanders selected by the junta. The West African regional bloc, known as ECOWAS, has threatened economic sanctions if the deposed president is not released. South Korea's military says it's keeping a close watch on North Korea amid signs that the country is preparing to stage another new military parade. It will likely showcase its growing nuclear and missile capabilities. North Korea often celebrates major state anniversaries by rolling out thousands of troops and its most advanced military hardware. Experts view them as an attempt to pressure Washington over the stalemated nuclear diplomacy. A court in Belarus has sentenced 2 leading opposition activists to lengthy prison terms in the latest crackdown on dissent. Maria Kolesnikova, a top member of the Opposition Coordination Council, has been in custody since her arrest a year ago. A court in Minsk found her guilty of conspiring to seize power, creating an extremist organization, and for calling for actions damaging state security. They sentenced her to 11 years in prison. Lawyer Maxim Zanak, another council member, was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Haiti's government is warning about a spike in kidnappings and other crimes as it pledges to fight gangs. The announcement has drawn reaction from two crime bosses that any crackdown will bring greater violence aimed at police in the already unstable country. Prime Minister Ariel Henry now heads the government following the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse in early July. Mr. Henry said Monday that one of his priorities is to make Haiti safer. The Argentina-Brazil World Cup qualifier was halted just 7 minutes into the game. The game was halted on Sunday and chaos followed. 4 Argentina players from English Premier League clubs were accused by agents of Brazil's health agency of breaching coronavirus restriction rules. This is because they did not declare on arrival in Brazil that they'd been in England within the previous 14 days. Chinese social media platform Weibo has banned a fan club of South Korean K-pop band BTS from posting for 60 days. Weibo says the club, which has over 1.1 million followers, raised funds illegally. The Chinese government has been restricting the entertainment industry and is clamping down on what it calls irrational behavior by fans. A major maritime industry association has backed plans for a global carbon price on shipping. The International Chamber of Shipping says all vessels trading globally above a certain size should pay a set amount per metric ton of carbon dioxide they emit. The shipping industry is estimated to account for around 3% of greenhouse gas emissions. Several countries have dabbled in cryptocurrencies, but none has gone as far as El Salvador. It has adopted Bitcoin as an official currency today. The Central American nation is betting it will spur the economy and increase money sent home by Salvadorians in the U.S. In Australia, a father is calling it a miracle that his young son survived 3 days alone, lost in the rugged Australian woodlands. The 3-year-old boy, wearing only a sweatshirt and diapers, was found in good condition sitting on a creek. Hundreds of people had been searching for Anthony A.J. Alphalak, who has autism and is nonverbal, since he went missing from the family's remote rural property north of Sydney late Friday morning. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and this was Forum Daily. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.